The night was quiet in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, a stillness that amplified every small sound. Lieutenant Sarah Miller sat in her patrol car, watching from the corner of West End Avenue. She told herself she was just keeping an eye on things, but something else was at play. Then she saw him, a tall, black man in a dark, tailored suit, walking along the sidewalk near a high-end boutique. His confident stride caught her attention. She didn't like it. Sarah flicked on her headlights and rolled the car forward. As she pulled up beside him, she leaned out the window. "You live around here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. The man turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. "Excuse me?" His tone was even, neither defensive nor hostile. Sarah stepped out of the car. "It's a simple question. You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." It wasn't true, but it was enough for her. The man sighed. "I'd like to know what description that is." Sarah squared her shoulders. Dark suit, tall, walking in an area with recent break-ins. She saw a flicker in his eyes, not fear, but annoyance. "I see," he said. "Well, I'd be happy to clarify anything. Do you have probable cause to detain me?" Sarah clenched her jaw. His composed tone grated on her nerves. "Let's see some ID." The man hesitated, knowing where this was going. Before he could reach into his pocket, Sarah took a step forward. "Hands where I can see them," he exhaled, frustrated. "Officer, this is unnecessary. Turn around." His shoulders tensed. "Are you arresting me? Turn around." He did so slowly, carefully. She cuffed him. It was done, but something felt off. No arguments, no shouting, no threats of a lawsuit, just quiet compliance. It was like he knew this was only the beginning. She didn't realize how right he was. The hum of voices filled the Davidson County Courthouse. Lieutenant Sarah Miller adjusted her uniform. She'd been here before, given her account, walked out without a second thought. This was just another day, another suspect, another open and shut case. Except it wasn't. Across the room, Marcus Johnson sat at the defense table, relaxed, hands folded. He didn't look like a man on trial. That annoyed Sarah. She took the stand, waiting for the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, to begin. He nodded politely. "Lieutenant Miller, can you walk us through the night of the arrest?" "I was on patrol around 10:30 p.m. I noticed the defendant acting suspiciously near several businesses with recent break-ins." "And what led you to detain him?" "His behavior. He appeared to be surveying the area, taking his time near closed storefronts. I asked for ID, and he refused to comply." Marcus watched the defense attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her late 40s. She adjusted her glasses. "Lieutenant Miller," she began, "are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment?" Sarah felt irritation. "Of course." "Then you understand an officer needs reasonable suspicion to detain someone. Can you specify what Mr. Johnson was doing that made him a suspect?" Sarah stiffened. "As I said, he was loitering near a high-end shopping area late at night." The defense attorney raised an eyebrow. "Loitering? Would you say walking is a crime?" Sarah exhaled. "It depends on the circumstances." "Right. So did you witness Mr. Johnson attempt to enter any closed businesses?" "No." "Did he run, hide, or display any behavior suggesting criminal intent?" Sarah hesitated. "No." The man sighed. "I'd like to know what description that is." Sarah squared her shoulders. "Dark suit, tall, walking in an area with recent break-ins." She saw a flicker in his eyes, not fear but annoyance. "I see," he said. "Well, I'd be happy to clarify anything. Do you have probable cause to detain me?" Sarah clenched her jaw. His composed tone grated on her nerves. "Let's see some ID." The man hesitated, knowing where this was going. Before he could reach into his pocket, Sarah took a step forward. "Hands where I can see them!" He exhaled, frustrated. "Officer, this is unnecessary. Turn around." His shoulders tensed. "Are you arresting me?" "Turn around." He did so slowly, carefully. She cuffed him. It was done, but something felt off. No arguments, no shouting, no threats of a lawsuit, just quiet compliance. It was like he knew this was only the beginning. She didn't realize how right he was. The hum of voices filled the Davidson County Courthouse. Lieutenant Sarah Miller adjusted her uniform. She'd been here before, given her account, walked out without a second thought. This was just another day, another suspect, another open and shut case. Except it wasn't. Across the room, Marcus Johnson sat at the defense table, relaxed, hands folded. He didn't look like a man on trial. That annoyed Sarah. She took the stand, waiting for the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, to begin. He nodded politely. Suspected based on what? Victoria sighed, setting the document down. You keep saying that, Lieutenant, but let's examine the facts. You had no description of a suspect that matched him. You didn't see him commit a crime. You didn't even witness anything close to illegal behavior. And yet you arrested him. She let the words hang for a second before adding, Did you ever stop to consider that he might have just been a man walking home? Karen felt the heat rising in her chest. I did what any officer would do in my position. Victoria didn't blink. Would you have done the same if he were white? A ripple went through the courtroom. Someone coughed. The judge gave a warning glance, but the tension was already thick in the air. Karen forced herself to keep her face neutral. Race had nothing to do with it. Victoria nodded, as if she expected that answer. Let's move on. You ran his name through the system after his arrest, correct? Karen hesitated. Yes. Victoria held up another paper. Did you find anything? Karen exhaled. No. No warrants, no priors, nothing. Victoria let that settle before stepping closer. So, to recap, an innocent man with no criminal record who wasn't breaking any laws was arrested simply because you thought he looked suspicious? Karen clenched her jaw. I stand by my decision. Victoria didn't argue. She just turned to the jury. That's all, Your Honor. Karen exhaled as the judge called for a recess. She stood, straightening her uniform, and made her way toward the hallway. But the moment she stepped outside, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. Across the corridor, Marcus Johnson was shaking hands with a court clerk, who then leaned in and whispered something to Victoria. Karen's pulse quickened. She didn't know what was going on, but whatever it was about to change everything. Karen's fingers curled into her lap as Marcus Johnson stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. The quiet confidence in his posture sent a ripple through the courtroom, not just because of the way he moved, but because he wasn't acting like a man fighting for his innocence. He was acting like a man who had already won. The judge looked up from the folder, her expression unreadable. Mr. Johnson, you may proceed. Karen stiffened. Since when did defendants get to proceed? Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. Your Honor, I've remained silent throughout most of these proceedings, allowing my counsel to present my case, but I believe it's time I speak for myself. Karen felt her stomach tighten. He's too calm, too controlled. Go ahead, the judge said. Marcus turned his gaze, landing on her. Lieutenant Miller, he said evenly, do you remember the night of my arrest? Karen's mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to nod. Of course. And you testified under oath that you stopped me because I appeared suspicious, that I was loitering in a wealthy area, that you were acting in the best interest of public safety. She sat up straighter. That's correct. A small knowing smile played at the corner of his lips. Interesting. Karen clenched her jaw. Marcus turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to formally introduce myself. A hush fell over the room. My name is Special Agent Marcus Johnson. I am a federal investigator with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. For the past 7 months, I have been working undercover to identify patterns of unlawful policing, specifically targeting cases of racial profiling and false arrests. Karen's heart stopped. She barely registered the collective murmur sweeping through the courtroom. The prosecutor turned to her, his face pale. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out a Department of Justice badge, holding it up for the judge to see. This case was never about me being a suspect. It was about me being a target. Karen's vision tunneled. No, this wasn't happening. The judge nodded slowly. I've reviewed the documents presented by Mr. Johnson's team. It appears this arrest was not only unjustified, but also a direct violation of his constitutional rights. A stunned silence gripped the courtroom. Karen's breath came shallow as the weight of the judge's words sank in. Marcus continued, his voice measured but firm. Your Honor, my investigation has uncovered multiple instances of similar misconduct within this department. This arrest was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Given this new evidence, does the state wish to proceed? The prosecutor hesitated, then shook his head. No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Johnson immediately. The gavel struck once. Motion granted. Mr. Johnson, you are free to go. Marcus exhaled, then slipped his badge back into his pocket. He turned to Karen, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Miller, I suggest you prepare yourself. This is only the beginning. Karen felt her stomach drop. As Marcus strode out of the courtroom, she knew. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built was about to come crashing down. Karen sat frozen, the courtroom buzzing with whispers, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Special agent. She had arrested a federal agent under false pretenses. Not just any agent, one investigating cops like her. Terence remained standing, his badge still in hand, but his eyes were locked on her. Now, Lieutenant Miller, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate, would you like to know why I was in that neighborhood that night? Karen swallowed, her throat like sandpaper. He didn't wait for an answer. I was there following a lead on corrupt policing. He let the words sink in before continuing. We'd been receiving complaints about an officer in this district. Unlawful stops, racial profiling, false reports. Karen's pulse hammered in her ears. So I went out that night, alone, no wires, no backup, just me. He tilted his head slightly, to see if the stories were true. Karen could barely breathe. Terence turned toward the judge, and within minutes of my arrival I was stopped and detained without cause. He looked back at her. By you. The weight of it crashed over her. This was never a routine arrest. She had walked right into a setup, and she hadn't even known. The judge exhaled. Agent Johnson, given the severity of what's been presented here, I assume the DOJ will be taking further action? Karen's hands curled into fists under the table. Terence gave a slow nod. Yes, Your Honor. The Department of Justice will be conducting a full review of Lieutenant Miller's cases, as well as the department's handling of civilian interactions. Karen's breath hitched. A full review. That meant every stop she had made, every arrest, every report, everything she had ever done in uniform was about to be picked apart. She gritted her teeth. This wasn't fair. She was just doing her job. The judge nodded solemnly. Then this court will cooperate with any federal investigation as needed. Terence finally sat down. The tension in the air didn't lift. Karen's mind whirled. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was the cop. He was supposed to be the criminal. But today, the badge on her chest didn't mean power. It meant scrutiny, and soon it might not be hers to wear at all. But the worst part? She wasn't sure she could even argue that she didn't deserve it. Karen's hands felt clammy against the polished wood of the table. The courtroom had quieted, but the weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on her like a vice. She had spent years believing in her own authority, convinced that her instincts were always right, that she could tell who was trouble and who wasn't, that she could justify any decision she made in the name of public safety. But today, she had been the one on trial. The judge glanced at her one last time before standing. This concludes today's proceedings. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, a sharp, final sound. Karen didn't move. For the first time in her career, she didn't know where she stood. The courtroom slowly emptied, but Terence Johnson remained seated, watching her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something else. disappointment that stung more than anything. As he stood, he slid his DOJ badge back into his jacket and buttoned it smoothly. "It didn't have to be this way, Lieutenant." Karen swallowed, but she had no words. Terence shook his head slightly. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" She bristled. "I was doing my job." He let out a short breath. "No, you were doing what you thought you could get away with." Karen clenched her jaw. "How many others?" Terence asked. She froze. "How many people have you done this to?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She didn't have an answer, and that silence was answer enough. Terence studied her for a long moment, then simply shook his head and walked toward the exit. The defense team followed. The judge disappeared into chambers. Even the prosecutor, who had been seated beside Karen all trial, quickly packed up his things and left without a word. Karen was alone. She exhaled slowly and finally pushed herself up from her chair. But as she moved toward the door, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass panel. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she recognized the person staring back. All these years, she thought she had control. She thought she was the one deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now, she wasn't in control of anything, and that terrified her, because for the first time she saw herself the way others had always seen her, not as the hero, not as the protector, but as the problem. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Don't be like her. Power isn't a shield against accountability. If you stay silent when you see injustice, you're part of the problem. Speak up, pay attention, and never assume that authority makes someone right. If you found this story thought-provoking, subscribe for more.